Right, so here we have the next chapter in our story, which is about Methodist College in Belfast, 1978 to 1980. So anyway, I went home to Belfast, and Dad did the needful. What does that mean? Well, it means he helped me. And I have to think, looking back, how ungrateful I was to my father at the time, and indeed for many years afterwards. I was still young and arrogant, about 28. Yeah, and so I was ungrateful, not just to my dad, but to my mum as well. Western youth, for me, that's me, are the most appallingly soft and spoiled youth of any culture that I know. But unfortunately, psychologically, they are isolated and very vulnerable because no one really gives a damn about them apart from their biological relatives. For me, Western culture is a sad joke, really, compared to many other cultures that I've lived in and read about in the literature. In other words, cultures that I've seen and even experienced. Sadly, I have more respect for the youth of many other cultures than I have for Western youth. In retrospect, I myself was no exception. I was quite an, I don't know what's the word, truculent youth. I wouldn't say obnoxious, but not far off it at times. I was certainly obsessed with myself and my own problems. What I needed, of course, was to have some responsibility. But it happened to me only quite late in life. But so ultimately, I don't think it was my own fault. But neither was my family able to do anything about it. It was the culture itself. The same is true today. It's not the fault of youth that they are the way they are. It's the culture they are brought up in and are surrounded by. They find themselves immersed in it. That is the tragedy. I was not belligerent as a youth, but I was a kind of pain in the neck in a passive-aggressive way, I'd say. Anyway, Dad stepped in my situation. I'd lost my job or resigned, and he took me to see a friend of his, Ernie, who was the head of Grosvenor High School in Belfast at the time. And this was an old friend of Dad. In fact, he was related in some way. Of course, I just nodded and didn't say much. I didn't like Dad helping me, but I realized that, I had to get a job. I didn't like not working. So I just nodded and didn't say much. Anyway, after the chat, Ernie subsequently phoned the head of Methodist College, Jim Kincaid, and he phoned me to come for an interview. Well, can you believe it? Talk about being headhunted. I mean, Methodist College is the top school, I'd say, in Northern Ireland. Beautiful, great, big grammar school. And the head called me and invited me for an interview. Wow. Thanks, Dad. Anyway, I met Kincaid, and the head of the biology department a few days later. And I was offered a job at Methodist College as a biology teacher. I just couldn't believe it. And I'd say that this was my first and possibly my last job at a really good school. I'll say why. The Methody was a school which had the correct balance with regard to discipline for the teachers. In other words, the students were reasonably well behaved and they were not rude to the teachers, not on a routine basis. Of course, there were some incidents, but yeah, overall, pretty good. And the students, yeah, it was quite a relaxed atmosphere in most of the classrooms that I saw there. And I could see that they enjoyed themselves. So this school had got it right. Now, I'm only talking about 1978 to 80, and I know these things change. But at that time, it was right. Anyway, so I had Dad to thank for all this. Although I didn't thank him at the time very much. Dad was worried about me not having a job, of course. Of course, he could see that. But there it was, the arrogance of youth. Methody was a great school. Although I had my work cut out in the first year, keeping up with the preparation, because it was a good high standard academically, I found it almost therapeutic compared to King's Hospital in Dublin. The students were much better behaved, and I felt much more comfortable with the staff even. I really learned how to teach at Methody. In retrospect, I should have stayed there for another couple of years, but I was bitten with the African bug. In my second year, I was actually asked to go into the boarding again. Again, I was requested by somebody to go into the boarding department at Methody, and I went in and I had a great year there. I had my own room in the dormitories. You know, I did my duties there in the evenings, but I really enjoyed it. And on the social scene, well, I became involved with the Returned Volunteer Action Group in Belfast, which met once a month and organised activities for overseas students in Belfast. And, you know, I remember there were lots of good friends who, like me, had returned from VSO in various parts of the world. I remember them all, Janet and Bruce and Eileen and Jim and Hazel and Jim and Eileen. And yeah, we had a great, you know, we had so much in common with this VSO experience. And we organised parties and picnics for various foreigners who were living in Belfast at the time, often mainly Pakistanis, Iranians, Africans. Among these was one chap who I became very friendly with, Pakistani, called Muzaffar Khan. And he was an Ahmadi Muslim, which, from what I could gather, was a kind of liberal, quote, type of Muslim. He was a tall, impressive figure, and he was a PhD student at Queen's University. I used to enjoy his company and invited him home regularly to meet the family. In fact, he spent one Christmas with us in Dundonald with my parents. We often went to the Queen's University Social Club and had a Guinness on a Friday evening. And, you know, he was a Muslim, so they're not supposed to drink alcohol. So, Muzaffar even had one or two Guinness himself. We used to chat and discuss the social scene. In other words, we checked out the ladies. We called it together zoological studies. I remember taking Muzaffar and his brother, who came to visit him, to Portaferry one day for a trip. And yeah, Muzaffar was a great favourite with Mum and Dad. They really liked him. Dad, in his clumsy way, mistook his name and used to call him Mustafa all the time, because this was the extent of Dad's knowledge of Arabs, was the name. And the latter, Muzaffar, would laugh at this all the time when he got the name wrong. He had a good sense of humour. Later in the summer, I remember taking Muzaffar to Donegal for holiday with David Crawford, my friend, who of course was a Christian. And I remember them having animated discussions about Christianity and religion. The Methody years were fairly uneventful, really, otherwise. I spent 2 years there. Socially, apart from return volunteer action, nothing really happened. I still was clueless about how to approach the opposite sex, especially Irish girls, who to me seemed to be so complicated. Rather like myself, in fact. It seemed to me that women wanted to be entertained all the time. And it was all form and no content for me. I wanted intense, deep, and meaningful conversations, which of course was the last thing that the women wanted. No surprise then, no surprise that I wasn't successful with them when I was there. I was a very frustrated guy in all senses of the word at this time. My intuition told me I was never going to have a satisfactory relationship with any Irish, English, or Western type white female. Yeah, and I think I was pretty much right about that. I developed a distinct persona to cope with my social situation in these years. I was basically very shy, but with a serious need to be noticed. I don't like being ignored. This was a very dangerous combination of traits. The persona had two opposing aspects. On the one hand, I was the quiet, silent type who observed with feigned calm the frivolous but fascinating interchanges of others. On the other hand, when ignored for too long, I could be unpredictable, even jovial, in a forced and frenetic, contrived and backslapping way. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, etc. This complex persona quite naturally confused many people at times, including myself, as I wasn't quite sure which of the two personas was the real me. Of course, they both were me. It was, or they were, a persona which I was to use for most of the rest of my life in white Western cultures. The boarding house at Methody was really quite interesting. I had interesting colleagues there. Stephen was an interesting character. He was my boss, my housemaster. He was a physics teacher, but disillusioned with teaching. Sensible man. He was in the process of retraining to be an engineer. He was basically a very straight guy, conservative, but an excellent housemaster, and who found me entertaining and at the same time perplexing. Then there was Iki Piki. Iki Piki was a man called Ekin who had huge brown eyes and blonde hair and who had grown up in Chile, of all places. I remember he was an old Campbellian, so I remembered him from Campbell, my Campbell days. He was a little bit weird. He was like a kind of cartoon character, really. But he wasn't a teacher. He was an excellent assistant in the boarding department. Got on very well with the students. To this day, I don't know if Iki Piki was really real or just playing a role the whole time in his daily dealings with people. And that actually seems to be a characteristic of old Campbellians. You can never really tell whether they're real or playing a role. The boarders certainly had to do a lot to survive in that environment. Then there was Jerry T. He was the only Catholic, and that was a real rarity at Methody on the staff, because you have to remember Northern Ireland was divided, religiously between the Catholics and the Protestants. Almost everyone in the world knows about that division. It's so famous. So Jerry was the only Catholic. Very nice fellow. Then there was Robert from the geography department, who was also in boarding. Nothing special, but a fine and agreeable colleague to work with. And then there was Graham. And he was a biology teaching colleague of me. And he actually was dating one of his ex-sixth form students when I was there. And he eventually married one of my former students. And that meant a student that I taught at Methody, he eventually married. This was after I left Methody. A lady named Lynn. And I remember teaching her. She was an excellent student, getting top marks in the biology test. Anyway, she got top marks in Graham's eyes because Graham fell in love with her and married her. And Lynn actually then, having been my student, went on. When I left Methody and went over to Africa again, she became a teacher at Methody and she replaced me as the teacher. Isn't that a coincidence? Near the end of the year, Jay, who's ex-Methody, joined the boarding department, and he seemed to know his way around. There was nothing you could teach Jay. Well, he'd been in the boarding department. He was great. He was a fine fellow, as indeed were all these people in their own way. All these colleagues at Methody. I had great respect for them. But Jay was a little crude. I remember one very funny incident in the staff TV room at night in the boarding department. I went in one night and Jay was sitting watching the TV. The next thing, Jay let out this most enormous fart. It was so loud. And before I knew it, I had said in a tone of serious irritation, Johnson, kindly ameliorate your manners. And the phraseology actually here, and as an English teacher now, and the collocation of those two words, ameliorate and manners, do not go together. They don't go together. It's a grammatical error, but I didn't even know it at the time. Just shows you, I'm a native speaker. You see, all of these things are really about language, aren't they? All these memories of mine. Anyway, I think Lockwood came in next. The phrase, and saw it, and he laughed. Yeah, he burst into laughter at what I had said, and he laughed at it every time he thought of it for years to come in the future. Stephen was one of those guys I tried to keep up with when I went to Africa, but of course, although I kept back and coming to see them, those friendships all became weaker and dissolved eventually. People don't bother in the end trying to keep up friendships. Unless you keep nourishing it, they die. So, anyway, this was a good example of what a little prude I really was in those days. I mean, if you'd told me at the time this story, I would never have admitted it. Why would I get upset about somebody farting? But there you go. In fact, I've always been a bit of a prude about many things. And come to think of it, I probably still am. So this is a kind of a goat track. This is it's something that's established very early in life. There was also a rather sad story then, because there was a young man called Ian, who was a lovely fellow, who also was an ex-volunteer. And he was in this boarding house with me. And so sadly, he developed cancer of the brain, a tumour, at the age of about 23. Tragically, Ian died at the end of the year. Now, what's perhaps even sadder is that this incident had very little impact upon me. I remember that. Why couldn't I empathize more? It just seemed like everybody was ignoring him, and I just ignored him too. Nobody knew how to speak to him. Could anybody speak to him? We couldn't. But anyway, I remember thinking, oh, the arrogance of youth. Such a little impact did Ian's death have on all of us. The boarding staff were all a great bunch of people, and I quite often went out for them for a drink on Friday nights with them to the local pub. I sometimes went on the other nights as well. We had Monday club, Tuesday club. The teachers were very easy to get on with in Methody compared to the King's Hospital gang in Dublin. So, why, you may well ask, why, when I seemed to like the place so much, did I start looking for jobs in Africa again? A very good question indeed, which would need a skilled psychologist to give an objective answer. Perhaps even a psychiatrist. I don't know what my biographer would say, but that is exactly what I did. I always felt I was different from other people in Ireland or England. I think I was in love with the warm congeniality of Africans, which had given me the opportunity to break out of my complex negative persona which I developed to survive in Ireland. That is really why I think I went back to Africa. Anyway, not too fast. At the end of my first year in Methody, I went for a summer vacation trip to Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi with a friend. We had a marvelous trip. Zambia was so good because we visited Gibson and Karen, my friends from Bristol days, and they were contract teaching in Zambia. Malawi was beautiful, and I fell in love with it. The purple mountains, the azure blue skies, and the friendly people. It was just too much for me. I was smitten. I knew I just had to go back. So, in October, when I saw an advertisement in my oldest friend, the Times Educational Supplement, for a science teacher in Malawi with an organization called Christians Abroad, I applied and was invited for interview to London.